Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to give it another minute or two just to see if some other people join, and then we'll get started.
I'll just start sharing my screen. Marianne, you might just let me know if you can see it.
Yep, we can see it, Mike. Okay, so I think we'll make a start. So welcome everybody. My name is Marianne de Bond and welcome to our procurement webinar. We are delighted to see so many projects here today. We're expecting about 250 people to join us today, which is fantastic. So thank you for joining and welcome. We hope this is going to be a really useful session for you. Just a couple of things just to ask of you, because we do have so many people joining us today. We will have a presentation with our expert panel, and then we will go into a Q&A session. If I can ask that if there are projects who have multiple people attending, if you could appoint one person to be the one to ask your questions, just to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to ask questions and we can try and cover as many as we can. So as I say, we'll have a presentation with our panel and then we'll move into the Q&A section. I'm delighted to introduce you to our panel this morning. We have Mike McGrath from Arvo, who are a specialist procurement consultancy, and we're delighted to have him here today. Mike and his team have been doing some work with our capital projects already, so they have a really good understanding of SEUPB, the kind of things we do and the kind of support that projects need. I'm also delighted to introduce Emma Fallis, who is our very own eligibility manager and a font of all knowledge here at SEUPB. So we're in really good hands today, and I think this is going to be a really great session for everybody. So I'm going to hand over to Mike and Emma. Please do start sending your questions in via the Q&A, which is just the button at the top of your screen. We have the meeting chat turned off, so questions can only come in through the Q&A, and we will then review those once we've finished our presentation. So I'll hand you over to Mike and Emma.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I appreciate the introduction, and it's great to meet everyone this morning. Great to see such interest in public procurement on a Monday morning. I'm going to continue with the presentation. We're going to cover a lot. I will tell you that. We're going to cover a lot of information over the next 90 minutes, and we're going to have time for Q&A as well. But if there's questions that we don't get to, we will follow up with you afterwards. And the information I'm sharing will be shared, the presentation and slides will be shared as well afterwards, because there's lots of notes that you could take and there's lots of links to more information as well, which will be relevant to you and your projects. Emma's going to support me and jump in specifically when there's real focus on SEUPB concerns or queries or aspects of public procurement which we need to reinforce. So I'll continue if that's okay. Hopefully you can see the agenda there. So briefly we look at PEACEPLUS in terms of what the project is, what the nature of that initiative is. There's a brief overview of public procurement, and we're going to get into some of the key principles of public procurement. The nuance as well, and the interesting part is just in terms of location in Northern Ireland and Ireland. There are regulations that impact you are both UK, EU, Irish as well. So you just need to consider those regulations and how they interact as well. Then we'll go through the practical steps. So there's a bit of theory first in terms of regulations, and then we're going to get into some of the practical steps of a public procurement process, making a purchase, evaluating tenders, modifications, contract as they arise. So as we go through the presentation, it's going to get that bit more practical, but it's all really very relevant. It's all very important. And finally, then we're going to look at just the reporting piece towards the end. So that's the agenda. In terms of PEACEPLUS, it's a unique program in Europe. As you're probably aware, it's a cross-border funding program supported by the EU, the government of the UK, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the government of Ireland and Northern Ireland administration. That's highlighted specifically because the funders behind this project are across multiple jurisdictions, and the UK and Northern Ireland, because of Brexit, has different new Procurement Act regulations as well. So it's important just to reiterate that. The programme, as you're fully aware, is designed to support peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland and the border counties. And it has been doing this for over 25 years. So, and it's open to businesses, community groups, and other interested parties. And we say that businesses, contract authorities, some of them are very familiar with public procurement, and others, community groups and interested parties, may not be familiar as others with public procurement. So today's presentation is across the entire remit. And again, all the information will be shared, so we'll make it very practical for those that are new to public procurement, and then some of the more advanced topics can be picked up in the Q&A. So in general, in terms of procurement, when there's public money involved, when there's public funds involved, you have to abide by the regulations, and the regulations exist to make sure that public procurement is fair, transparent, and this impacts all procurement. So it's works, as in capital works, where we do a lot of work with SEUPB. It's goods, and then also services. So irrespective of what you're spending, whether it's capital goods or services, public procurement will impact you. And the principles are set out in the Treaty of Rome, and these are from the EU principles. And the principles from the new Procurement Act in the UK are very similar. You will see a reiteration of transparency. The entire process around procurement and how you spend the money, how you appoint a supplier, needs to be open and clear and fair. There's ethics involved in ensuring that there's fairness and honesty in all decision making and how it impacts buyers and suppliers. The same rules will apply to all suppliers involved. That you're getting value for money. That money is not being wasted. That you're balancing cost and quality and looking at sustainability criteria as well. Interesting that the new Procurement Act in the UK focuses on the most advantageous tender, whereas the EU up until currently and continues to focus on the most economically advantageous tender. So it's not just about cost and price anymore, it's just about getting the best value and solution overall. There's accountability then as well, and there's clear responsibilities for anyone that's involved in public procurement. There is accountability and responsibilities, and you should know that from the pre-planning stage up to the tender, the contracting award, and the management of that contract afterwards. So those responsibilities need to be clear and set out. Finally then as well, I'm just going to move my screen there one sec. Sustainability is very important. So even since the principles of public procurement came into play, which is over 10 years ago now, sustainability and ESG has emerged as a very strong theme, and we see that in the new Procurement Act. So you need to make sure that the decision you're making is sustainable, but it's also beneficial to the environment. In terms of the principles are derived here, as we mentioned, from value for money, appropriateness, common sense, transparency. Everything needs to be fair, equitable, and value for money. How you demonstrate that is by keeping appropriate records. This is one of the most important things to take away from today. Public procurement requires a lot of documentation. It requires documentation from the pre-planning, when you come up to a concept or a project, when you want project initiation. And PEACEPLUS and SEUPB require a lot of documentation and paperwork as well, from the planning stage right up to the contract award and the management of implementation. So appropriate documentation and keeping those documents, which we'll get into in a later stage, is very important. So there's a very clear audit trail. You also need to make sure, as a contracting authority, and clarify, a contracting authority is anyone that's buying, anyone that's spending money. And there's a couple of titles that we'll show you shortly. But you would need to make sure that there's appropriate measures to prevent conflicts of interest. So conflict of interest is when a party that's benefiting, or someone that's involved in decision making, that can benefit themselves, a family member, and they're awarding contracts which isn't fair, or isn't transparent, and isn't meeting the principles of public procurement. So we'll show it shortly, more definitions around conflict of interest as well, what that's involved. But before we get into it, a contracting authority And this is a definition in the regulations, and it's the same in the EU and it's the same in the UK. It's any public sector body that's legally required to follow public procurement rules. And that includes all government departments, all schools, police, local authorities, health bodies, non-department bodies, and also, as you can see here down the bottom, bodies in receipt of public funds from PEACEPLUS. So that affects the stakeholders on this meeting today. In terms of the principles of public procurement from an Irish and an EU perspective, in fact, and considering SEUPB, the majority of the funding is coming from the EU, the public procurements of the EU will apply. The EU directives have been in existence now since 2014. And while we spoke previously about a new Procurement Act in the UK that's impacting Northern Ireland, you can expect a new e-procurement regulations to come out over the next number of years. I was involved the last time the regulations coming out, and I've been contacted recently because the regulations from the EU are, I won't say expiring, but they need an upgrade. They need to be all up to date. They need to focus on more practical engagements with suppliers, SMEs, focus more on sustainability and for more digital tools. And that's what the Procurement Act in the UK has done. So just something to be aware of. While we speak about public procurement right now, we are talking about the current EU procurement rules. We're talking about the Procurement Act in the UK. But if your projects continue for the next 12, 18, 24 months, there might be new there might be new EU procurement rules come into place. You just need to be conscious of that at the time and make sure that you're operating to the regulations that are in place at the time. All partners in receipt of PEACEPLUS funding, as you can see there, must comply with the regulations that are available to them at the time. The slight divergence in the change that we've had, particularly for Northern Ireland, is because of Brexit. With the UK's departure from the EU, the UK contract authorities are no longer obliged by EU regulations. So since then, and since the 24th of February this year, the UK has implemented the Procurement Act in 2020. The Procurement Act 23 was started implementation in February 25. This is not just like this. These new regulations, as you're aware, is not just affecting procurement; it's affecting different aspects of business and life as well. And that's the UK's prerogative as part of being a non-member of the EU to set their own regulations. But you just need to be conscious of that and how they impact you. You need to be conscious of the money that's being spent in Northern Ireland, the contractors, the suppliers that you may be using in Northern Ireland, how they're impacted by the UK Act. And we'll get into more details on that. It is quite new. And I know from working with a number of contracting authorities, there are more obligations. So there's obligations to simplify public procurement, to break down the lots for SMEs. But there's also more notices, there's more administration on the systems. There's new find a tender system to be used, which we'll cover off shortly as well. But you just need to be conscious of these changes. Emma, do you want to make a point?
I'll just add as well that yes, there is a new Procurement Act that has come into place on the 24th of February 25 for all Northern Ireland contracting authorities, but it does diverge from the EU public procurement regulations. And the fact that we're in receipt of EU funding, we have to make sure that all our partners are using, the EU regulations. So if you're using a contract that was previously published before or awarded before the 24th of February, that's fine. It'll be under the old public contract regulation, and that then is in full compliance with the EU Public Procurement Directive. The challenge is then any procurement then that you want to enter into or publish after the 24th of February, because you have to ensure that we actually are following the EU Public Procurement Directive and not the Procurement Act 23, as I say, diverges from the EU Act. So we have to make sure that all our projects are compliant and follow the EU directives.
That makes sense. Thank you, Emma. And the challenges of when public procurement, we're talking about legislation and obligations, and unfortunately, when things go wrong in public procurement, there are challenges. It does hit the media. There are legal challenges. There's delays in projects, and we're trying to avoid situations like the Children's Hospital in Dublin, which is an example of when public procurement went wrong, when there was poor control on the scope and delivery of the project, and the budgets were significantly never even achieved. So there's lots of smaller examples, but it's just be conscious of when you're spending public money, when it does go wrong. Unfortunately, the media do hear about it. and you need to be able to justify all your decisions as well. So if contracting authorities need to be able to record and demonstrate that they're working towards the public procurement, they're compliant with the directives and legislation, and it's a controller general from an Irish and an EU perspective would be monitoring that. And if you're taking note in terms of what we're going to cover here, will ensure compliance with those regulations and the best practices that you can follow. From a SEUPB perspective, from a funding perspective, there are penalties, and if you're not compliant with the regulations or if not compliant with the rules and the information and the grants that you've received, there's penalties and financial penalties, and it go from 100% of the projects not being funded down to minor implications of 5%. But obviously, we're trying to get to a situation where there's no penalties and there's full compliance. Where penalties arise or where difficulties arise, and this is from SEUPB's 25 years experience on this, it's inadequate advertising. So not advertising the opportunities that there's enough competition. It's not being fair, it's not being transparent, there isn't enough competition. So inadequate advertising. If you use the portals that are available from e-tenders, find the contract, you will find that those portals will advertise the opportunities for you. Accepting late tenders, now, this is a difficulty, and you could also put in even conflicts of interest there as well when there's evaluation taking place that might impact the tenders, particularly if they're received after the deadlines. Amending or introducing new selection and award criteria. So this would be bad practice for those that are used to public procurement. It's a mistake that's made by people that are novices or new to public procurement. You cannot change the criteria of the decision making after you receive the proposals back. Once you set up your procurement, you need to decide on the selection and award criteria. You need to adhere to it. You need to evaluate based on that criteria. You need to award the contract based on that criteria. You can't be in a situation where you're amending the criteria and how you make the decision because of some new information that emerged through the process. Then there's administration steps that you need to publish in the contract notices and the award notices on OJU, which is the European Journal for Publishing Contract Tenders, and modifications as well. So public procurement and the new Public Procurement Act in the UK, and I suspect the new e-procurement rules when they come, public procurement isn't so rigid that you can't have modifications, but you need to be aware of that. You need to document that from the early stage. There might be modifications, there's changes and challenges that happen beyond your control, and you need to have some flexibility in that, and you need to be documented early in the process that there might be requirements that need to be changed. Now, we'll get into a lot more detail on this, but as long as you're aware of it, you can plan for it, making sure that if there's any modifications there above board, that they're compliant and they're not beyond the limits that are mentioned. So that's the first kind of chapter of today's session. Is just really about the public procurement regulations. There's a lot more information available online. We'll share some links as well as we mentioned about the regulations if you need more information. Today was just a brief overview. Now, when we get into the practicalities of making a purchase, this is when you decide that there is a purchase to be made. There's some high-level steps. We'll say there's the pre-tendering stage, the procurement itself, and then the operation. And people forget about the operation and the contract administration, the disputes, the reporting. So at a very high level, every single procurement, whether you're buying a small device for €300 or you're spending 3 million on a capital works project, there's just steps involved, and from a pre-tendering phase right up to the operation. And that's identifying that there's a requirement and a need for spend. You're creating a business case, which you've probably done with PEACEPLUS already. You're designing and planning. You're running the procurement, and that's where we'll focus a lot today in terms of the steps involved in the procurement. You're making a decision on a procurement, and you're implementing the contract and delivering on the work. There's reviews take place, and there's post-award appraisal. So they're at a very high level. They're the steps that are involved in all procurements. Now, depending on the value of the spend, so depending on how much you're going to spend and how much you need to get a third party to deliver for you in terms of value, depending on the value, it'll dictate the process. The first thing to note is the minimum spend amount here is €200 or £200. So if you're spending more than €200 or £200, there is a procurement process to follow. Anything below that is incidental in the grand scheme of things. There's different thresholds in from €200 to £200 up to 5,000. The key point around the 5,000 is we would not want to see artificially broken up lots. That we don't want to see multiple spends at 4,500 value. This was a practice in the past where people were looking at projects and they didn't want to go through a full procurement, so they'd spend 4,500 with two different suppliers for the same type of work. that's not compliant whatsoever. So you need to look at part of your budgeting and planning. You need to forecast and estimate the spend. You need to do market research and talk to potential suppliers and what the cost will be. And a lot of you will do this anyway. This is all good practice as part of setting out your budget, good project management. But the thresholds that are here should be decided after you realize what the budget is going to be and what's available to spend and what the expectation is on the cost around capital goods and services. So depending on your threshold, then you'll decide, you'll take different steps and different routes. The lower value, lower obligations, lower risk, more straightforward. The higher thresholds, when we go over €50,000 and up beyond up the EU threshold, that's where it gets much more sophisticated. There's a lot more risk involved for everyone, and there's a lot more due diligence and reporting required too. So just bear that in mind. The steps involved here are very practical, and there's more document information available from the PEACEPLUS guidelines that you received as well. We'll get into more details on the thresholds as we go through it. The one thing about the thresholds is they're not static. They do change. So every 2 years, typically, the EU will update their thresholds. And depending on the thresholds, then it decides on the process and the journey that you take as well. So you'll see here, just from the EU thresholds, as we cover them off, which are available in OJU, public bodies like the Office of Government Procurement in Ireland will update these as well and communicate them out. So in terms of supplies and services, it's typically 143,000 for those listed in schedule, but most of you in this sector here are going to be 221,000. So when you're spending over 220,000, that's when the EU legislation will kick in. If it's a utility sector, if you're in the utility sector, it's 443,000 for supplies and services. For works contracts, all the values are the same. When you spend more than 5.5 million, the EU legislation is impacting your public procurement decision, and that's more rigid, it's more robust, and there's stricter timeframes involved and everything like that. So you do need to be conscious of those thresholds, and like I said, they do change, they do evolve over time. So make sure you're kept up to date when they do change.
Mike, I should go back to the previous slide. I just want to reinforce just what's required for each of the thresholds, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. I just want to just as Mike already has touched on about there's different thresholds that have been set for the PEACEPLUS programme, and they are sort of based on a combination of national rules, both within Northern Ireland and Ireland. So between, as Mike had said, we're concerned about artificial splitting, making sure that that isn't a factor. So between €200 or £200 and €5,000, these are excluding VAT. You have to have evidence of receiving at least one an oral quote or a quote to show that, like basically a price check to show that you're getting value for money. If the goods or services that you're hoping to purchase are between €5,000 and €50,000, excluding VAT, you actually have to go through then and seek at least quotes from 3 competent suppliers. And what we mean by a competent supplier is somebody who ordinarily provides those goods and services. So, but what we would say is that you shouldn't restrict it to only asking 3 people to quote if you know that there's more, because you want to make sure that you get a good response rate. And as Mike has already said, the principles of procurement need to be respected, and you need to show that you have been made as best efforts as possible to try and ensure that you've obtained that. Then between €50,000 and or 50,000 sterling and the EU threshold, a full procurement action is required. Mike already has reiterated at the beginning that PEACEPLUS programme is a cross-border programme. So we expect procurement processes to be undertaken also on a cross-border basis, unless your project is a single jurisdiction project. And if it is, you will actually, you can discuss that with your JS officer. But in the main, all our projects are cross-border in nature and should be advertised as such. So you can advertise those contracts between 50,000 and the EU Journal on the procurement websites. So it's eTenders NI or eSourcing NI and eTenders Ireland. But if you don't have access to those procurement portals, the national press should be used as a means to advertising your contracts. So just want to just sort of talk through those very important sort of thresholds and what the requirements are. Further information is contained within Annex 2 of the programme manual, and just it's to make sure, as Mike also talked about, the procurement penalties that can be applied for inadequate procurement. Basically, you can get a penalty for taking the inadequate procurement action based on the value of your contract. So you need to make sure that you're following the correct process. And then the above the threshold, then, which is the next slide, then this is the EU threshold. The main point is advertising. Your contract needs to be advertised on the official journal, and the thing that has maybe can sort of trip some partners up, and we already have had the Commission ruling on this. The find a tender service is not a substitute to advertising your contract on the official journal of the European Union or the OJEU. So you need to ensure that if your works or services contracts fit within or above any of these thresholds, you must ensure that you advertise on the official journal. Thanks, Mike.
Perfect, thanks, Emma. And that brings just one point from my mind as well. So find a tender service is used to post tenders, and e-tender system is used to post tenders, and e-tenders is compliant with OJEU, the European Union. So we don't expect the authorities to publish the same tenders entirely on both systems. What you should do is publish a tender possibly on the OJEU compliance system, and have a notice on find a tender pointing to it. So you couldn't run and evaluate two separate contracts on both systems. You run the tender competition in one system, but the other system needs to point to it that there's a notice period, the notice that's going in the other system. So that's the way that you can manage that, and I know that has come up in the past.
Yes, and I think in relation to that, that's something then for if your organisation is requiring, because of your own rules, that you must advertise your tender and find a tender service, that is for your organisation to decide on and manage. As especially Programme's body dealing with the PEACEPLUS funding, it's not something we will either we check or monitor or look to see you've advertised your tender and find a tender service. It comes down to the governance arrangements of your own organisation, to what you are required to do. Okay.
Thanks, Emma. Just slightly adding on here, similar specifically for PEACEPLUS, in terms of some changes recently and just those dates, just to make sure yourselves, maybe when you applied for funding, that the rules here might have changed in the threshold. So up until the 31st of March this year, contracts above 30,000 euros or pounds. And since then, from the 1st of April, it's contracts over 50,000 euros are to be advertised regionally in the papers I mentioned in Northern Ireland, Board of Counties, on the national procurement websites, and voluntary and OJEU as well. So just be conscious of those, that date line there that has changed since the 1st of April. And in terms of making a step, so we've gone through the thresholds, we've decided on the procurement process. Again, irrespective of whether you're spending 200 euros or 200,000 or multiple millions on a project, there's the number of steps which are relevant to every procurement. And the first thing is around setting a specification, setting out clearly, very clearly, what is being sought. We'll get into the difficulties when you don't set a clear specification shortly. So having a specification for a request for a quote or request for tender is very important. Having a process for gathering up submissions and proposals from suppliers that's transparent as an audit trail that shows decision making and stakeholders involved is very important. Reporting on the submission. So once you get the proposals back, whichever format they're in or whichever systems you're using, that there's clear process involved in evaluation, making a decision, awarding a particular contract, and finally that approval. And the people that are involved, the stakeholders involved, it needs to be clearly documented. So this is very basic stuff, and I know most of you are doing this anyway, but when it comes into procurement, then there are steps when it's above an EU tender threshold. There's different choices of how you run a procurement. Some of you will have procurement policies when your organizations which dictate or have a preference over here. Most public procurements are run on an open procedure, and that ensures maximum transparency and maximum competition when there's no restrictions whatsoever on the procurement. The open procedure is the fastest, and and generally it's the fastest. It's the most open, most transparent, and has the highest competition, where you can get the best value for money. And if you're running an open tender and there's one or zero supply, if there's zero replies or there's only one reply, it demonstrates as well that there's a single source situation, which we'll come to in a while. There is restrictive procedures which is possible, where you can set criteria to pre-qualify. There's benefits to doing that, which we can get into as well. And then there's more complex ones, which are around competitive dialogue, competitive procedure negotiation. These are all more when it's highly more complex, highly more technical. From my experience with SEUPB, which spans about 5 years now at this stage, you're rarely down here. You're going to be running open, sometimes restricted. It is a very clear business case to do that. In terms of the open procedure, just briefly in terms of the steps involved, and hopefully you can read this, and like I said, the slides will be shared as well afterwards, so you'll see it. The contract notices of an open procedure need to be published on the e-tender system when overdue. They need to have an appropriate time for submission, so that typically is 35 days, where the opportunity is live on the system online, where suppliers in the market can have an opportunity to review the opportunity and submit a proposal. So you're giving time to do that. You need to examine the tenders in a very clear manner. It's focusing on your selection and award criteria, which were set out at the initial planning stage of your procurement. So you need to make sure that you're working with companies proposals that meet the requirements in the selection criteria. Then you're using the award tier to set out that's in the RFT to make a decision, and the stakeholders that who's ever involved in the valuation, which we'll come to shortly, are constantly referring back to the award criteria, and you're making a decision based on the criteria that's submitted and the proposal that's in place. You need to advertise the outcome of the tender. You need to communicate the success or unsuccessful situation, the regret letter, the award letter, as the case may be. That needs to be communicated. You need to manage a standstill period. So there's a period of 2 weeks where an unsuccessful supplier has an opportunity to raise feedback or queries or challenges, or they may halt, they may decide to, if they're not happy with the outcome. It just makes sure that everything is fair and transparent. And you know this when you start out the procurement, that you have to give feedback to everyone, and that if there's any challenges or difficulties in the decision-making process, it's going to be reflected here. So that makes sure that you run procurement correctly, you stick to your criteria, and everything is documented fairly. You initiate the contract, and then there's an obligation to publish the award notice on overdue, and that's very important for PEACEPLUS perspective as well. So PEACEPLUS expenditure, all the documentation, as we mentioned here earlier, needs to be retained for 5 years for the year that the payment was finally received. So there's a significant documentation archival system required afterwards to make sure that you can hang on to that information, the decision making, who's involved in the pre-planning of the procurement, who ran the tender, the procurement, the evaluation, and the decision making, the operation of the contract as well. So that's important to note. In terms of PEACEPLUS specifically as well, the default position, and Emma mentioned in this, all procurement should be on a cross-border basis. So tenders need to be advertised in Ireland and Northern Ireland. It's rare, but it may occur if there's a single jurisdiction involved, and that's important to note as well. In terms of hierarchy of rules, so the EU rules are number one. You need to abide by the EU rules. You need to abide by the PEACEPLUS program rules, which are in the program manual. You need to abide by the national rules, and there's probably one step underneath that as well, where you need to abide by your own procurement policies within your organisations. Many of you might be part of a large local authority. You all have a procurement policy as well, and a manual, so you need to look at those rules too. And the challenge will be when there's a slight conflict between them, but that's the hierarchy of rules. Just bear that in mind. And the lead partner has the onus and responsibility to make sure that these are followed and implemented and documented. We mentioned briefly about a specification, and this is something that we can spend a little bit of time here, but for those new to procurement in particular, and this is important for works, goods and services, it's very important that there's a clear document set out outlining exactly what the nature of the procurement is, what's the value that the third party is going to deliver value for you. So it sets out all the requirements for goods and services and works, and it does it in various methods and means depending on the nature of what's been procured. A document, a requirement document is the starting point for a lot of procurement, and it's worth spending a lot of time on the specification. And the example that I had earlier in the Children's Hospital in Dublin, there wasn't much time at all spent on the specification. The specification kept changing. So that's a challenge when procurement goes wrong. So the specification it needs to be very important. And the steps involved, firstly, you're determining the need, and obviously as PEACEPLUS benefactors, there's a need, there's a program, there's a project that needs to be set out. So you talk to the stakeholders, you talk to experts, you talk to technical users and budget holders, and you're setting out, documenting their requirements. You can do research, then you can look at past tenders or past contracts of a similar value. You can do research and talk to companies, and this is something that people are often confused about with public procurement. It's okay to speak to the market in your pre-market consultation. It's okay to do your market research prior to the tender being published, to understand specifications, requirements, budgets, estimated costs, etc. It's not okay to take the information from one company and include that in a specification. You need to do research with multiple parties, and you need to be fair and transparent. So that's where the principles of public procurement always come up. So your market research is important. And there was a perception in the past that you couldn't speak to the market before a tender came out. That's not true. It's a good procurement to speak to the market, but to do it fairly, openly, transparently. Do it in a focus group, a wider group, and invite as many suppliers if you wish. But it's worth doing, and you will learn from that process before you run your procurement. A good specification will help you identify the risks. So there's many risks that may arise, technical, logistical, legislative, financial risks. There's different risks that arise, so it's important that a good spec will highlight those for you. You're setting out the scope of the tender, what's involved for the successful tender, and what's out of scope. And that's important to clarify as well. Looking at the value and looking at the lifetime value of this, not just looking at the initial purchase. And we see this mistake with people sometimes buying equipment, not thinking about the maintenance and repairs and parts and components, consumables, and that are used afterwards. So look at the full life cycle and the overall value. And when you have a document, I'm going to say a document, it might be a PowerPoint, it might be a spreadsheet, there's different formats of what a specification can take. When you have that set out, you can then decide around your selection award criteria. It's easier to decide on what type of supplier could deliver this when we're very clear on what you're looking to purchase. Briefly, I suppose, when poor tender specs are written, there's non-compliant, there's just challenges, there's no response from the market, or you're getting poor value for money. You end up buying the wrong thing or paying too much. If there's a spec that's over-engineered or under-engineered, which I've seen both situations in the past, it doesn't meet their optimal budget. We have seen specs that were entirely failed and they had to redo the entire procurement, and that's a wasted effort from everyone. You're not getting the full benefit, and it's difficult to manage a contract. It's really difficult to manage a supplier and a contract afterwards if you don't have a clear specification in mind in terms of what the outcome should be for your capital project, your goods project, or your services that you deliver. So that's the value of getting the specification right. After you get your spec right, and whether you're running an RFQ or an RFT, a full-blown tender, you need to set your selection criteria. So there's a difference between selection criteria and award criteria. Selection criteria is looking in the rear view mirror. It's looking at the supplier that you want to work with, the third party, contract party who you want to work with. So looking at the type of supplier you want, where location is one thing, but even their size in terms of financial turnover, their capacities, their insurances, their qualifications. If you're looking for, a basic example is a solicitor and accountant that you want them to be qualified in that practice. But if you want somebody with specialist skills, you want to make sure that they have the certifications, the standards, the CV, the people in the third party to deliver. So a selection criteria is looking back, I suppose, in terms of what a company has right now, and you're passing and failing them based on that. So it's yes, no, pass, fail is what you're doing with your selection criteria. And cleverly well-designed selection criteria is very helpful for a tender. It'll reduce the number of candidates. It'll make it very focused and get you a better quality supplier. The award criteria, actually, sorry, just before I go on to the award criteria, is looking forward, but there's a couple more examples here on selection criteria. So there's lots of EU information on this in terms of companies that don't have their tax affairs up to order, that are involved in money laundering, child labour, etc. Different checks and controls and balances. We see more people looking for more sustainability criteria now because of the ESG requirements that are emerging from the EU government and national governments as well. So you can include those where it's relevant to the project. And you can define your selection criteria. There's an example here on screen in terms of your economic financial standing. There is an acronym there in the middle called the ESPD, the European Single Passport Document. So this is a document that a supplier, a third party, can complete to say that they adhere to all your criteria, and they can reuse that. It's just ideally a quicker way for them to reply to tenders. So the selection criteria, like I said, is looking at the type of suppliers that you're looking to work with. The awarding criteria is looking forward. So this is looking at the contract, the project that you have, and looking forward to see who's the best supplier that can deliver this project. So looking at after the companies that come through your selection criteria, your shortlist, which of these companies gives us the best value and the best proposal. And that's slightly changed. For the EU has focused on the most economically advantageous tender for decades. The new UK Procurement Act is focusing more on the most advantageous tender, and the benefit there is looking at quality, sustainability, social, environmental impact. So it's not just based on price. There are some award criteria examples here. There's actually only 4 types that you can actually have. There's a fixed price, there's a fixed cost, there's the benefit, the blend of price and quality, which down the bottom you'll see is often 70-30 quality or 80-20 quality. The higher the price side, the higher the focus on price, the lower the cost will be. But it's sometimes, as you all know, the lowest cost is not always the best outcome afterwards. So just be conscious of that when you do increase the price threshold, and sometimes lower commoditized items or commodities that are regularly available in the market are more price driven. When it's more complex, when it's more unique, when it's creating something very creative and artistic, lowest price is not often the best outcome. So that's where quality is important. So getting that blend, that best price quality ratio is important, and that criteria needs to be set out during the tendering process. It needs to be evaluated afterwards based on that criteria. Your award and regret letters are going out based on this award criteria, and the decision you're making is based on the criteria too. So don't overlook the importance of getting this criteria right. And in finding the criteria, there's typically a scoring matrix. You could have scores out of 1,000 or 100 or 10,000, and you can break it down then based on how much points and quality you want to focus on for cost and price, a combination of those. And then there's other criteria, award criteria. When you're looking at services, you're often looking at services methodology, an understanding of the brief, the technical merit of the resources that are involved. So there's examples here that was used for a payroll tender, which I've seen in the past. And it's important just to spend as much time as possible setting those award criteria. There's other examples here. So based on how quickly the turnaround is, or the project plan, we've seen projects that are urgent, and then there's a higher award given to a company that can deliver it in a shorter space of time. So delivery periods, the delivery process, how they plan to deliver it, the expertise that they have, the running costs that are involved, the aesthetic look and feel of it, how it's designed for all its users and stakeholders, the technical merit, the after-sales support. So if I mentioned about equipment earlier, that's not just a one-time purchase. There's also the after-sales services, consumables, maintenance. You might have value in that. That might be important. It might be a unique piece of equipment that needs to be a specialist maintenance service. So making sure you understand that from the outset. You can look at other aspects then around social, environmental. There's a lot of focus on green public procurement over the last number of years, and that's important. That procurement bodies, contracting authorities are bringing the market forward in terms of green procurement and environmental procurement solutions. So you can consider those where it's relevant to your project. And then there's other factors as well that you consider. So if there's any questions on the award criteria, please let us know in the chat feature. I was just going to move on to evaluations at this stage. So we're stepping through it quite quickly. I'm just conscious of time as well. So we've looked at the legislation, the regulations, we looked at our budget and our thresholds and the process we're following. We've set our specification, we're quite clear on what we're purchasing. We've set some selection criteria to preclude unsuitable suppliers. We've done our award criteria to design exactly the type of third-party supplier we're looking for. And now we're getting back to the evaluation. So the evaluation will happen when the proposals come back after the particular deadline. And in the middle between that, there might be some clarifications that arise. So it's important as a contracting authority that if there's questions being raised on your spec, or there's questions of confusion on your tender, that when you get a clarification or a question, that you're broadcasting that information as a fact out to all potential bidders. So that makes sure that the transparent process involved. So once that happens, once that concludes, you're looking at your evaluation. So this is where you're getting ideally a range of suppliers interested in working with you and delivering the project on your behalf. You need to nominate a preferred supplier. You need to nominate the supplier that's going to be the best combination of value, expertise, and capability. So you're looking at that based on the information that they've sent through, and we're going through that now in terms of the evaluation. So once the deadline has passed for the tender, you can assemble your evaluation team. You should, part of your design process in your tender, you should be identifying who the evaluation team should consist of anyway, based on their expertise, availability, and impact in the company, impact into the project. And you're looking then based on the criteria that's set out. So in terms of the evaluation, there's the process, I suppose, is one thing, but the evaluation things to consider. Firstly is the criteria. So the selection award criteria that's set out in your tender is what you're focusing on in terms of making the decision. You're looking at the evaluation team, that's the people that are involved, and then it typically 3 to 5 people is what we would normally see in terms of evaluation, depending on how complex it is. That would be best practice that there's more than, certainly there shouldn't be a situation where there's one person, unless you're down at the 200, 300 euro decision making. But when it's a complex tender or project, you should have an evaluation team. You're looking at the documents, the bid documents that have been sent through, the proposals, and that's what you should be only focusing on. You shouldn't be focusing on any information that you hear about the company in the media, or hearsay, or past experience. You're focusing on the evaluation on what's submitted in the tender proposal, evaluating that against the criteria that we mentioned. Possibly sometimes there's site visits and there's clarifications and there's this discussion. I noticed with the new Procurement Act in the UK, there's a lot more collaboration, presentations, dialogue happening in the evaluation process, which is practical, which is probably how the world operates. So that's not particularly the case in the EU right now, but we monitor that in the future as that changes. And you conclude your evaluation report in your decision by a very robust report that the chairperson of the evaluation group should take ownership of, documenting how the process worked in terms of the evaluation, who was involved, what suppliers involved, what evaluation team members involved, how the decision was arrived to, the criteria that was met, etc. So there's very clear reporting. And when a tender goes wrong, go back to the challenges we had earlier, when there's a contract fails, there's always a lot of focus on the evaluation in terms of what happened, how you decided on that particular supplier, and whether the right decision was made. And there's different situations and scenarios that come up. And evaluation takes quite some time, particularly for complex, longer capital projects. You need to budget and time frame in weeks as opposed to hours or days. It can take weeks to run through an evaluation thoroughly, particularly if there's lots of suppliers, lots of bidders in place. So that happens. What does occur, what we do have the opportunity to do is, and this is something that people forget, is clarification. So as you receive tender proposals, as you're evaluating them, you do have the opportunity to ask questions, same as suppliers asking you contracting authority questions during the tender process. During the evaluation process, you reverse that, and you have the opportunities to ask questions to the suppliers and bidders to get clarity. If there's something that's confusing, conflicting, if there's something that you need more information from. Sometimes we've seen it where the pricing schedules are slightly different and companies are giving prices to two different things, and just to make it fair to everyone, we want to make sure that everyone is quoting on the same thing. So that's where clarification can arise. It has to be documented and fair. You can't have clarifications offline or through a phone call. It should be through the system, and there's an audit trail there for that. But during the clarification process, if there's presentations and anything, any dialogue, all the principles of procurement apply here. So you need to make sure that clarifications are equal, they're transparent, there's no discrimination, and they're proportional in terms of their actions as well. And if there's anything ambiguous about the entire tender or the bidder, that's where you should clarify. You should not make a decision or not evaluate, not award a contract if there's suspicion or if there's some confusion or you're not clear on a particular aspect of a project. So get clarity on it while you have the opportunity. In terms of the evaluation, there is a strong documentation and audit trail involved in the documentation that you should be starting out with. The first is the confidentiality from the evaluation members, that what the information is confidential and for the nature of the project and the purpose at hand. There's conflict of interest, so we'll talk about that shortly. You're looking at the quotations, the tenders, the proposals as they come in, and just those, not anything else that's outside the scope of this. You're focusing on your request and your tender documents, and that's particularly looking at your selection and your award criteria. You're getting a copy of all the clarifications that came up during the responses. You may have an evaluation template, and there's evaluation templates available online, and even some of those new procurement systems have evaluation templates as well. And a draft report template. So you should be working towards a tender report. You should be working towards a successful supplier being awarded a contract and a clear decision making around that, and the stakeholders and everything is documented in a report. So they're really the key documents that are involved in the documentation. There's quite a bit of text here. I'll just glance over. So this is all very common sense, particularly for those of you that have done evaluations before. So the best practices are you need to make sure that you're the right people with the necessary skills, the competence to understand the project, that everything is documented, as I mentioned multiple times already, that you're considering the requirements from the jurisdiction you're in, the project that you're in, PEACEPLUS, and everything is documented fairly and signed off from a public procurement perspective. You're giving sufficient time for everyone to work and evaluate on the evaluation itself. You should not take into account any irrelevant consideration. So as I mentioned, sometimes there's information in the media about a company, or you might hear locally in terms of a stakeholder. But you can't evaluate anything that's not in the tender document. So that's very important to clarify in terms of the tender document, the proposal. This is where your focus and priority is. If a company forgets to include something interesting and relevant, that's their business. You can't know that they're after winning an award for their health and safety if they haven't put it into the tender document, even though it might be on their website, etc. And you should also use external experts. So external experts. If you're procuring something for a first time, or if you're building a bridge or putting in flood lighting, or there's a particular project that's the task that's quite unique and hasn't been done before, make sure that you bring somebody in, even as a third-party consultant, to sit on the evaluation team that knows how to buy that procured project or service, or that goods or service, just because there might be some particular nuances that you may not understand. We often see this sometimes actually with software and technology, but the technology landscape keeps evolving and changing. There's new technologies in AI. It's difficult for contracting authorities to be buying some solutions around AI if you're not an AI expert. So that's where you bring people in. That's more my day job than SEUPB, but it's important as an example to bring in the right people that you have available to you to make sure that you're making an evaluation and a decision that's fully coherent and understood by everyone. So that's the evaluation. In terms of the award criteria, there's going through the criteria you have here. You can set a scoring matrix in your tender, which is important. As you can see over the left-hand side, this table over here. And then on the right-hand side, there's examples of the criteria. You can weight the criteria. This is an example of what the CPD would typically use for quality criteria, and that they have a ranking and a scoring. This is all transparent in as well. This is where the public procurement principles come in. It's transparent. The criteria set out at the outset. And then the criteria is evaluated during the tender, and the letters and the contract award notice at the very end, they all use the same criteria, and that's delivering a transparency in the process. Down the bottom right, then you have the cost, where what effectively that formula means is that whoever has the lowest price in the tender at the time that's relevant will receive the maximum marks available, and everyone else is scored against that relatively. That's how the CPD would evaluate it in Northern Ireland. In my next slide here, if I can move on, the OGP have a slightly different format, but the similar principles apply. You can use similar weighted criteria. You can use a range or percentages in terms of that scoring criteria, but they have the same scoring matrix in from a cost perspective. These are examples usually available online, and you can use these as you see within your tenders to get the best decision. In terms of mistakes, and this is something that is always focused on if there's a tender that fails or a contract that fails afterwards, or a dispute, they're often looking at the evaluation mistakes. They look at the specification, look at the tender process, they look at the evaluation of what happened. So where mistakes can be made is where the individual or the evaluation team comments don't relate to the question. So as part of the evaluation, you need to give feedback to all the proposals and all the tenders, and feedback needs to be fair and accurate and relevant to their own proposal. And sometimes the commentary may not specifically relate to the question, so that's important. The PCR on criteria, you cannot in public procurement introduce any new or personal criteria. That's important to note as well. You can only use the selection award criteria that are in the tender document. There can't be any positive or negative bias towards an incumbent or any other candidate. So irrespective of what they've done in the past, that if it's not reflected in the tender, it cannot be accounted for in the valuation. You do get challenges as well if you're not giving sufficient feedback. So particularly to unsuccessful candidates, unsuccessful tenders, they've got into time to prepare a proposal. So it's important to give them sufficient feedback, accurate feedback, not anything generic or vague. It's a skill in itself in terms of giving that feedback and getting the balance right between what you can say about their tender proposal without giving information on the successful candidate, etc. And then just finally, there's in terms of comments and awards, we often see that people writing that they got an excellent response, but they're only scored 3 out of 5 or 60%, which isn't an excellent score. So just making sure there's a line there. So between those, so that's relatively straightforward. In terms of the next step, then I'm going to continue going because I know we want to keep time for questions as well. In terms of the next stage, so we've gone through our evaluation, and now we've got to a situation where we've a likely candidate, we've a likely most economically advantageous tender or most advantageous tender, and that's where you're going to a decision and you're looking to award a contract. Now, the contract isn't signed yet. This is the whole process of awarding the contract. The contract award process is usually straightforward for the successful candidate if the terms of the contract are agreeable to everyone. And there's often a bit of dialogue there on the contract terms. Where the contract award process can be challenging is for the unsuccessful candidates if they feel that the decision was not correct. If they're not happy with the decision, which is often the case, or they feel that the decision was incorrect, they may have challenges there. So this is how you manage that situation. So the first thing you do after you run your evaluation and you've concluded it is you need to create a letter, a communication with a standstill. It's called a standstill letter. When you're abiding to the public procurement regulations. Typically it's for 2 weeks, so it's 14 days, and it allows an unsuccessful candidate to look at the feedback, evaluate their scores, and decide if they're happy or unhappy with that. And if they're unhappy, they may challenge or they may question your decision making and your evaluation process. So this is something to be aware of. Where this comes in, the more complex or the more valuable the projects are, this is where you get more challenges. The smaller projects, if it's a couple of hundred, couple of €1,000, people may not get too upset. But when it's a multi-million euro project, this is where they can challenge. All right, so just be conscious of that, and it needs to be very clear, need to be very fair. Sophisticated suppliers that have been tendering for quite some time appreciate the feedback, and they learn from the feedback. And if they agree with the feedback, if they can see where they had a particular weakness in the tender, then they'll learn from it as well. So it's not all difficult situations, but just make sure that you spend enough time managing the standstill period and giving feedback. In terms of the standstill period letters, there's quite a bit of information, and there's templates available for this, and I'll show them shortly from the CPD and the OGP and the new Procurement Act in the UK. Standstill period will have award criteria, as we said always: the successful tender, the score of the recipient, the score of the successful tender, so they can see their scores and name against the successful candidate. And then you're giving details in your reasoning. You're specifically including characteristics and the relative advantages of the successful tender. And then you're setting out a confirmation date of when the contracting authority will start. So that's the end of the standstill period. Those standstill periods are fixed, as I mentioned, and it's not enough to state in any way that the successful tender response was superior to the unsuccessful. It should state, reference specific matters, examples of facts, and explain why the decision of relative advantage was made of. So this is actually coming from legislation from a court challenge that challenged standstill letters in Ireland in the past. So it's important to adhere to that when you're setting out your award and regret letters afterwards. There's templates available, as I mentioned, and it's quite easy to complete them, particularly for a successful candidate. Where it's an unsuccessful candidate here, you need to a bit more detail, put in your award criteria, giving the feedback, etc., and you can get those templates available online. And that's the process in terms of the evaluation, or the outcome of the evaluation, the award decision. The one thing I'm going to mention here, just in terms before we go to modifying a contract. When you conclude the standstill period and there's no challenges from the unsuccessful bids, you can continue with the successful partner, and you can start talking about implementing the contract and the project itself. Now, the contract should have been included in the tender that went out originally, a draft contract. So it shouldn't be any surprise in terms of the terms that are involved for the successful candidate. However, sometimes there can be negotiation, or sometimes there might be a challenge in the contract that needs to be ironed out, and that's where legal advice is recommended, particularly if there's deviations from a standard contract template. Now, the standard contract templates exist from the government bodies. You can use those standard contract templates. Ideally, a supplier will adhere and they'll accept the contract template. If there's deviations, like I said, that's where you get into the contract negotiation. You're also making sure that it's compliant and that the risks are understood by both parties, and you don't want to be transferring the risk from the contract authority, from the supplier to the contract authority. You want to make sure that the onus and responsibility of delivering the contract is with the successful candidate, and now is the time to get that right in terms of that contract. So the contract will exist for the duration of the project until there's clear deliverables from a goods or services works perspective, and it's signed off and agreed, and there might be even subsequent maintenance periods after that as well. So the contract will exist. There are situations where modifications may occur, and this is something that has come up with SEUPB. I know Emma wants to highlight this in particular, but in terms of modifying a contract, it's possible. It's not ideal. We would always say try and avoid the situation and make sure the spec is clear from the outset, and the successful candidate and company is suitable to deliver it, and there isn't a need to modify a contract, but there is opportunities to modify a contract. It does need to apply, or still need to comply to all the rules of public procurement. You need to comply to the contract law. You can make a modification to a tender, a contract without running a new tender procurement, and that's set out in EU legislation there, as you'll see on that link. The principles, as I mentioned, is that modifications may occur to a small aspect of the contract, which we'll look at shortly, not the entire project. When it does look at a newer procurement, so this, if the modifications are introducing new conditions or new services that were not mentioned in the original tender, then you need to look at you need to cancel the existing contract and run a new procurement. Obviously, that's going to significantly delay your SEUPB project. So it's not, we don't want to be in the situation, but it might have to occur if the modification is introducing new requirements, new conditions. If you're changing the economic balance of the contract in favor of the contractor, that's where you look at new procurement. If there are substitutes being made to the original contract that was not unforeseen, or just significantly extending the scope or duration of the project. So it's a significant change, which we'll look at in terms of what significant means, then that's where modifications to occur. Again, there is information here from the EU legislation where you can make modifications without a new procurement. So this is where you can make changes. So where you can clearly set out, where it has been set out in the spec or in the tender contract at least, that modifications can occur. There are the Children's Hospital example in Dublin, there was obviously modifications could occur, and because the contract continues and there's modifications occurring. So there wasn't a new procurement set out there. If the tender specification has it, or the contract has an opportunity to accept modifications, and public procurement is not so rigid that you can't have modifications. There are unforeseen events which we'll look at shortly. Sometimes there's a change in requirements, or if it's a construction project, once you go underground, there may be a discovery that impacts the cost for the supplier, and that was unforeseen. If there's additional needs that were sought from the contractor or the supplier, it can be accepted. And the modifications can occur. The unforeseen circumstances, now there is a strict limit and cap on that. There was a rule of thumb in the past where it was 15% if there was if the scope of the project hadn't changed by less than 15%, but you can actually increase to 50% in certain situations we'll look at shortly. It does happen that there's corporate succession where there's a contractor being acquired or merged in the background, and then you'll have to update the contract as well. And it is minor changes. So minor changes, low impact, low risk, low threshold changes and modifications that can occur that are agreeable by both parties, that make sense to the project, then that's where you can modify the contract to reflect that. There's a couple more steps here in terms of modifications of when you can clearly retender, and there's a table here as well which I'll share shortly, which you can go through. So where there's a clear review clause and options where the modifications are explicitly allowed, you can make that change. Where there's additional works and they're not going to exceed 50% of the original value, and particularly when there's unforeseen circumstances, where a diligent buyer, and there was lots of contracts modified 5 years ago when when COVID-19 was upon us. There was lots of changes and delays and different changes in circumstances, how contracts were delivered. Nobody could foresee that would happen. So then there was contracts that the continuous service had to be delivered, but they had to be slightly altered to accommodate those changes. If you're replacing a contractor, as we mentioned, and particularly for low value modifications, like the 15% was a rule of thumb that we had for a long time, where the scope of the contract, the scope of services could change slightly, but had to be within 15% of the overall value. And that's where low modifications, low risks can take place. In terms of unforeseen events and unforeseen circumstances, there's some examples here. So we often get examples of what's unforeseen. Particularly, I suppose, with PEACEPLUS projects, some of them are over many years. There can be changes that can happen in the environment and the circumstances in the locality that are unforeseen. And so it's hard to predict these situations, and you should be looking at potential changes and risks and due diligence anyway, but sometimes they're completely unforeseen. In these rare cases, you can modify it. So something that happened that was objectively unpredictable, new regulations, as we mentioned with the Procurement Act in 23, they may not have been on your radar when you were applying for the funding. There is new public procurement rules coming in from the EU. There's no date on that. It could be 2 months or 2 years, but that's something that could happen. So there's new legislation, there's new safety requirements, and natural disaster. These are all completely unforeseen. The change must be essential to delivering the project. So you're not making changes because it'd be nice to do it now at this stage, or we'd like to change the colour just because it's nicer. It needs to be essential to deliver the contract. The contract needs to look the same. So you're not looking at any new services, any new requirements. There's no significant economic change of purpose to the contract. So the contract is still fundamentally the same contract. The financial impact of change control can't be exceeding 50% of the original contract value. And that 50% cap applies cumulatively as well. It's not just on this initial change. What unforeseen circumstances don't cover is adding in totally new services that are unrelated to the scope. There's what shouldn't be happening is it's been used as a backdoor to continue for a supplier to deliver work as opposed to running another tender contract. And if ever it goes over the 50%, it's a new contract. There's no derogation on that. Even if it's urgent and critical, a new tender competition is required. So hopefully that makes sense on that. There is one example here. I'll just give one example of an unforeseen circumstance. So a council local authority awarded 4-year contract for school heating systems. In year 2, the government introduced a new emergency national requirement for carbon filters to be included. So at that stage, the council needs to modify the contract to include and install the filters, which is unforeseeable. Switching contractors didn't make any sense. And it's legally allowed, like I said, where it was reasonably unforeseeable. The works contract didn't exceed 50% of the value, and the nature of the contract remains the same. So that's a brief example which you hopefully can relate to. I'm not going to read through these tables here because these are actually just more detail on what we just discussed. So if you need more information on the modification of contracts, Emma is going to share this information afterwards in a document. Is that correct, Emma?
Yes, these have come from a guide. It's actually, I suppose it's quite an old guide now, but it relates to the EU Public Procurement Directive. It was published in 2014, and it relates basically, it's a practitioner's guide on public procurement. But these are the annexes at the back, which I find are very useful. It goes through the different types of modifications you can go through. It asks you the types of questions that you need to ask yourself, and then it comes to the end. There's like a traffic light that tells you either yes, you can proceed, or no, you can't. So it can gives you good guidance on that. So there's 3 different sort of slides on the different types of modifications, and I'll share those as PDFs, so at least they're more legible, but they sort of go in line with everything that you've already covered today, Mike.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So that's 3 tables there. We spoke a lot there previously about obligations with public procurement on EU thresholds, and just to recap as well, there are spends that are below EU threshold, and you will have projects and you will have goods and services that are required that are below threshold. It's important that while the principles of EU threshold exist, there's other rules that govern your spend below that. They're set out in the PEACEPLUS guidelines. Where the EU regulations don't apply, you might have local and national regulations. You'll have your own procurement policies that apply as well. So the procurement is still governed and controlled. You need to look at time limits. There's shorter time limits when the spend is lower and below threshold. As I mentioned earlier, there's 35 days. Whereas you can be more flexible, and for smaller spends you can give 1 week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks if it's a bit more complex. The evaluation is not as complex as larger contracts. You might need a bigger evaluation team. You can undertake it quite quickly in terms of the evaluation. Sometimes if it's a very low spend in terms of the hundreds or a couple of thousands, you might just award it to the lowest price, as opposed to if everything else is commoditized. Or if you're buying something that is relatively available on the market, it can just be in the lowest price. So it's a quick decision. It just needs to be documented. But you do need the principles are still important. That there's transparency, clarity, and value for money. And if you have any questions around the support even below threshold, that you can ask, there's support available from any of the procurement agencies, OGP and ROI, CPD and NORT, SEUPB as well. Emma has a lot of expertise in procurement too. I'm not saying that, and ourselves at Arvo, we get a lot of procurement queries too for SEUPB projects. So raise those queries as opposed to ending up in a situation where there's confusion afterwards. Just reiterating some of the points that we mentioned earlier on the systems that are to be used. So etenders.gov.ie, is the system that's run by the OGP on behalf of the Irish government in ROI. Contracts now over the value of 50,000 or £50,000, exclusive of VAT. That's important to note as well. The figures are exclusive of VAT, must be published. Works contracts over 200k, 200,000. And there is a new obligation for public sector bodies in ROI to publish contract award notices, even if on contracts above 25,000. So if you spent 25 up to 50,000 on something outside of e-tenders and just ran an RFQ, a request for quotation, and got 3 quotes in and made a decision for €30,000 value as an example, you need to publish the contract award notice on e-tenders. It needs to be visible on what the public body is, where you're spending the money with, what supplier is the benefactor.
I want to say that that's an example of where we've had to sort of merge some of the national legislation and where the most stringent rule applies. So this is a requirement that has come from OGP for contracting authorities based in Ireland. So that's why we have to then sort of are bringing it into our programme rules as well. So those are sort of 3 points that the OGP have imposed upon Irish contracting authorities.
In the UK, considering the new Procurement Act and the new procurement system, and finding a tender service for tenders that are above EU threshold, lead partners must ensure that the tender opportunities are published in OJU as well. So, as mentioned earlier, it's not, you can't just publish it on FTS. If you're using FTS to manage the procurement evaluation, a notice needs to still go on OJU of the opportunity. It needs to be advertised in the Office of Journal of the EU, just to make sure that it does have that dual visibility in both jurisdictions. That's very important as a PEACEPLUS regulation. And for above threshold templates as well. So there are lots of templates available. So if what I discussed with you around running a tender or the evaluation letters and contracts is new or novel to your organization, if you don't have a suite of documents or are ready to go, then templates do exist. So the OGP and CPD have these templates available online. They're available for you to use and adapt and make sure that your procurements are compliant. SEUPB would strongly recommend using these templates as they've been through the process. They've been written by solicitors and they're available for you to use. And just one thing down the middle, that CPD does not provide procurement letter templates. It's more the contract and what they do have templates. Sorry, does provide procurement letter templates. And one thing they are doing, they do keep them up to date. That's what I should say. When you're using the OGP and the CPD templates, they're up to date right up to now in terms of any new legislation. So when there was new legislation came in about GDPR, data protection for individuals, when there's new requirements around sustainability and green criteria, there's new legislation that came in about working or potentially dealing with companies from Russia following the Ukraine invasion. EU brought in legislation banning that, and all the public procurement legislation documents were updated based to reflect that, and so are the EU templates as well. So just to make sure, by using the templates online and using the most recent versions online from OGP and CPD, you're keeping up to date on other peripheral regulations that exist around data protection, confidentiality, sustainability, etc. So just make sure that's adhered to. There's links here, apologies, you might not see them very clearly, they're quite long, but there are specific links to these documents and they'll be shared afterwards. I think Marianne's going to share those in terms of those slides. Okay, a couple of other matters, and we'll stop talking then for a while. We'll give you guys a chance to ask some questions, but there's a couple of other things before we get towards the end. So conflicts of interest is a big issue that arises in public procurement. It probably was more prevalent in the past. There's lots of more controls and awareness and education now about what conflict of interest is and how to avoid situations like that. But a potential conflict of interest can arise when there's persons involved in the procurement procedure that can influence the outcome of the procurement involving themselves directly, a family member, personal interests, professional affiliation that they have, a political or national affinity, or having direct or indirect financial or non-financial interest. So it's really about the integrity of the procurement. It's not just about the evaluation, which some people focus on in terms of conflict. It's actually involved in writing the tender, the pre-planning, the writing the specification, the selection and award criteria, and ultimately the evaluation. You need to make sure that there's no person involved in that process that's going to benefit financially or indirectly financially, there's a non-financial benefit or gain from them as well. You need to be very acute to that, and you need to ask and query the stakeholders involved to make sure that that situation doesn't exist. And I will say, in fairness, it's rare. These are becoming more rare that there's issues here, but it's just something to be very conscious of, and it requires a clear documentation. It requires owners and responsibility of people to record the stakeholders involved and any potential conflicts they have, and how to manage and address those conflicts as well is another part in terms of even asking a person to step out and be removed from the process. It's up to the partners to take measures to avoid it, identify it, and remedy it.
I just want to add as well that it is one of the areas that the Commission are very concerned with about is conflict of interest, and I suppose even in general they're very interested in public procurement because that's where sort of deficiencies can lie. But definitely one of the things is making sure that to reiterate that final point about the committee members should be completing a conflict of interest declaration before they assess any of the tenders, because that is definitely one of the things that the Commission will be looking for. So just want to make sure that everybody is mindful of that and does adhere to that requirement.
Perfect. That makes sense. That's good documentation to have. In terms of the conflict of interest as well, the contracting authority, particularly the lead partner, has the responsibility to take appropriate measures to identify, prevent, and remedy those conflicts of interest. A conflict of interest, as I mentioned, can include any relevant staff member that's directly or indirectly financial, economic, or personal interest to be gained from the outcome of the tender process. The directives are quite clear, and EU public procurement, as Emma mentioned, it clearly states from the contract article who is involved to conduct the procurement procedure and how they might be able to influence the outcome. Any personal interests which may impinge or might reasonably deem to others to impinge on a public official's impartiality in any manner relevant to his or her duties should be disclosed in line with management. So personal interests include an interest in a relative or connected person. So just be conscious of that, and the simple answer is to remove the stakeholder, remove the individual if there's a perceived conflict of interest, and it needs to be clearly documented too. In terms of reporting, so public procurement requires a lot of documentation and reporting. I'm not going to lie to you. It clearly there's a clear audit trail of all the decisions involved. There's a lot of information that's gathered pre-tender, pre-procurement in terms of the specification and the research, the tender process, setting out the selection award criteria, the clarifications, the companies that are involved, the companies that submitted bids, the evaluation, the clarifications, the contract negotiation, any amendments that are happening there, the contract itself, any modifications. You're building up a suite of documents, so you do need to be, the lead partner needs to consider that. You need to have an individual or a small team that are available, that have access to all the information to bring it together. That's very important for EU public procurement and also SEUPB. So in terms of the SEUPB being an SEUPB benefactor, benefiting from these funds, it requires clear documentation of the entire procurement procedure, right up to contract implementation and delivery afterwards, and any modifications, engagements with the supplier or that might occur. So most of the documentation and reporting looks at the reasoning, the justification of decisions that were made, why we set that criteria, why we provide that clarification, why that supplier was nominated, why we accepted the modification from the supplier in terms of the contract afterwards. You need to be able to justify and explain and indicate why in terms of what happened throughout the process. There's quite an example here in terms of a list of files that is more used as a checklist. I won't go through it all entirely, but you'll see this list referenced in the legislation from the OGP and CBD as well. There's different requirements that are required from a reporting perspective. As a summary here in terms of why you keep it, reporting ensures there is transparency and accountability around every around the monies that are spent from an EU perspective, and not just the EU, but from the Irish and the UK governments too. You're meeting your legal and audit requirements, so for a very clear audit trail is maintained. You're demonstrating value for money and fairness. Everything is transparent when you have that clear documentation. There's documentation that we gathered up at the planning stage around your business case and your justification, which you probably have done through SEUPB applications too. your procurement strategy, your estimating value in contracts, how you're setting your specifications, your engagement with the pre-market, your documentation, your surveys, etc., your pre-planning if you're doing a capital works or a local, if it does planning and documentation required. All that will help you bring into the suite of documents that's required. Other information here that's required in terms of reporting is around the tender preparation, everything around the invitation to tender, the selection criteria, the award criteria, the evaluation, who's involved, how you applied the criteria, how you made a decision, how you're documenting conflicts of interest, how you're awarding the decision, the letters that were communicated, any feedback or challenges back from unsuccessful tenders, the standstill period, and then the contract management itself. So how the contract was run, the KPIs, the milestones, the deliveries, everything that's in the document. So that's just an example of the reports that are really kept. And it's important, as mentioned down the bottom, that they are retained for 5 years. They can be audited at any time, 5 years after the project, I think it's after the final payment of the project.
That's right. And I just want to say as well, as Mike, you went through a great amount of information there that about reporting and capturing the information. Mostly that now, I suppose, is talking towards and focused towards above the threshold contracts, but it is very important to keep a summary or a report to a lesser extent, maybe not as detailed, but even for if you're seeking 3 quotes, it is useful to even do a 1-pager just outlining when you sought your quotes, who came back and who you appointed, because it summarises the process. It means as all, you have to think about your controller who'll be controlling your expenditure once you submit it in your partner reports. That makes it a lot easier for them as well to know. And also as well, somebody else, the fact that you have to keep your documentation for a period of time. If you have a challenge or something that somebody else, if staff change in your organisation, you know exactly what process you went through and what resulted in the award of a contract. So yes, so the information that's been included in those last couple of slides, I suppose, do relate to the EU directive and do say what the requirements regarding reporting are, but they, to a lesser extent, the same principles will apply to any of the thresholds of procurement. So it's just good practice to have some sort of a report for each of your procurement processes.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I won't go through it. This is just a checklist. This is just more examples of the procurement documents that you can keep and have a record of and have them available for potential audits in the future. This section here, Emma, do you want to go through this?
I will talk to this. Thanks. Yes.
Yeah.
Mike has brought us through, I suppose, how procurement happens, how we all should be doing it, and to ensure we have compliant processes. But unfortunately, there is situations where public procurement doesn't go according to plan, and maybe things have changed. And these couple of slides are based on a Commission decision document that the Commission had produced relating to non-compliance of public procurement. So the first set of penalties that can be applied relate to publicity and tender specification. So if you don't seek any quotes, again, these are applicable to all thresholds. So if you don't abide by the procurement action, either seeking a price check, getting 3 quotes, publicly advertising it, or not putting in the ODU, due to lack of publication, you can get 100% of that contract will be deemed ineligible. If you then, the next stage where you have inadequate advertising, where there's some extent, you've advertised to some extent, but not fully compliant, meaning that if you should have publicised it in the national press, but you only sought quotes, you didn't take the correct procurement action, results in maybe that the tender wasn't widely seen, a 25% value of the contract could be applied on that. We've already looked at artificial splitting, that can result in 100%. Insufficient time for potential bidders to obtain tender documentation or restrictions on obtaining tender documentation. There's a sort of scale between 5 and 25% on that. Non-compliance for time limits for receipt of tenders, anywhere between 10 and 100%. Failure of publishing and insufficient describing the selection and award criteria, a 25% penalty can be applied. Using criteria that deters bidders, there's also 25% for that as well. And the scope of the contract being insufficient or imprecise, it's 10%. So these all relate to areas that Mike talked about before, about what you have to do in your procurement process and what you should be doing. And this then is, in a way, if you look at it in reverse, if you know you can get a penalty for something, this is then to make sure that you don't do these things and make sure then your process is compliant. So the next slide then goes on then about then the selection and evaluation of tenders. There's also penalties in relation to this, where the selection criteria was modified after tenders were open or the criteria was incorrectly applied. Basically, the panel decided to either add criteria or didn't apply the criteria that was published in the tender documentation. A 25% penalty can be applied for that. Using criteria which is different to that stated in the specification, or any other criteria that wasn't published, there's a between 10 and 25% can be applied for that. An insufficient audit trail, so lack of justification for awarding the contract. So this is again where it's important to have your tender report and all your documentation that you maybe that there's an insufficient audit trail that maybe shows the tender went out and suddenly somebody was awarded the contract, but you can't understand, there's no scoring, you can't understand why a particular, because of if there was a selection and award criteria, it's not clear why a tender was awarded the contract. You can have a penalty between 25% and 100% depending on the severity of the error. If there's negotiation during the award process, and that's where the tender's been modified during the evaluation to favour a particular bidder, a 25% of the contract can be applied as a penalty. So prior involvement of bidders, and I know that Mike did say that that before you go out to the market, you can talk to potential suppliers to help you determine, I suppose, your specification to make sure that you're actually speccing the project correctly. But if after that point where you actually have awarded and you published your specification, if then you then irregularly involve bidders to actually favour them to give them preferential treatment, you can actually have 25% penalty applied on the contract as well. Procurement process where the negotiation, basically where there's conditions of the contract or the scope of the contract were altered, a 25% penalty as well. Unjustified rejection of abnormally low bids, there can be a 25% of the contract value can be deemed ineligible. Or again, what we've talked about, the conflict of interest, where the impact of the conflict of interest, because it wasn't managed, had an impact on the procurement process, and that can result in 100% financial correction. And then the last part of it then is in the next slide. That's about the contract implementation. So basically, where a contract has not been implemented in line with the EU Public Procurement Directive, so you can then it's either 25% of the initial contract value or 100% of the value of the contract if the certain limits. So that's where you're not abiding by the contract modification process that Mike talked about previously. And the two main things that you can allow contracts can be for services contract, you can extend a contract by 10% of the contract value, or 15% if it's works, and then there is other limits then that you can extend. But as I said, the sort of, as I referred to the traffic light document, the 3 slides that have the traffic lights are very useful to keep you right in what the scope, and to make sure if you have to modify a contract, what is allowed and what isn't allowed, because the contract the penalties that can be applied for not applying that can be very severe. And we want to make sure that projects actually implement their projects fully and do get reimbursed for all of their expenditure they've incurred in relation to procurement. But it is an area where it does attract a lot of attention from the Commission, and we therefore need to ensure that the projects are aware of what the consequences are if they don't implement compliant processes. Okay.
Very good. Thanks, Emma. And that actually brings us to a close in terms of the information we wanted to share. We thank everyone for their attention, and Emma and I are available now at this stage to go through some questions. Marianne, did you say you want to take a 1-minute break or a quick break? Or?
It's up to you guys. Would you like to have a quick comfort break and we can come back in 5 minutes?
I don't know, maybe 2 minutes or just if you want a very quick break. I see some hands going up there and questions. So
if we say we'll come back in a couple of minutes, just to give Emma and Mike a little bit of a rest. So yes, we'll come back with the questions in about 2 minutes.
Yeah, any questions that people have, we're very welcome. And I should have said at the start, and we should mention, Marianne, there's a separate presentation on Thursday that's more capital procurement related. So if your question is related to capital procurement and works, we may address it better on Thursday. I suppose it's probably the best way to put it. If it's quite complex, we'll hold off on that one on Thursday. But any general procurement questions, please welcome them to know.
So we'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Let's catch up in 2 minutes. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back everybody. And firstly, just to say thank you so much to Mike and Emma for that fantastic presentation. I think we can all see how much work and time had gone into that. So thank you both very much. We have about 16 questions here. Some of them are quite straightforward, so hopefully we can rattle through them quite quickly. So the first question is the procurement threshold cumulative for the length of the programme or yearly?
Procurement threshold is per action, so it's for to do with the procurement process that you're undertaking. So whatever you need to determine the scope of the works, as Michael talked about earlier on, do your planning and make sure then. So the thresholds we're talking about are per piece of procurement. Mike, have you anything you want to add to that?
So it's not annual. It's cumulative over the course of however long the project or piece of action requires. So it's not based on any calendar year. It does accumulate beyond the calendar if the action requires activity into the next year. Yeah.
Exactly. And I suppose the thing about is, what is it you are actually procuring for? If it is something that you are running over 2 or 3 years, yes, you do. It is cumulative, but you have to think about the activity. So if it's something that's one-off, it's the value of that activity one-off that will happen on a one-off occasion. If you're running, the simplest I would have always talked about is if you are having, again, this is more sort of an example about artificial splitting of contracts, but the same principle applies. If you know you're running a training course and it's going to run for 10 weeks, you know you need either your room hire for 10 weeks, you know you need your facilitator for 10 weeks, or your teas and coffees for 10 weeks. It's the value of each of those actions that you're procuring, not the separate action. But if you're running a mentoring program, your project has that, and you're running that for 2 or 3 years, you need to, it's the scope, you determine the scope and determine the value, and then your contract will run for that duration. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Emma. How are the updates to thresholds communicated, and to whom are they communicated to?
Then any updates to the thresholds are included in the programme manual, and once the programme, any revisions to the programme manual are made, lead partners are notified by the managing authority, and a copy of the programme manual is always available on the support portal, and it'll show then the live date of the manual. So we will always any changes on either national legislation or either EU thresholds will be incorporated into the programme manual, and it will outline the effective date then with which the programme will consider those.
Thank you. Is the €5,000 threshold an annual amount or over the period of the project?
I think we've already answered that one, Marianne, about it's to do with the procurement action. So it's determining the scope of the piece of work and valuing it, and then seeing then what procurement action that you have to do, what requires you to do based on what you need.
What is the process for specialised equipment services with only one supplier?
This is included. Yeah, maybe I'll let you, Mike, talk to this first of all.
Yeah, the first thing is it may be perceived that there's only one supplier, or sometimes the market will tell you there's only a supplier. You actually need to demonstrate and prove that by running a tender on an open tender competition like e-tenders or OJU, and getting that single supplier response. So you still need to demonstrate it. You cannot take it as hearsay. I do understand situations with some technologies and some equipment, but it's not for anyone to say without running a competition to demonstrate that there's only a single source supply. If there's a single source supply, leave them submit their proposal through e-tenders, contract with them as normal, and continue from there.
And that goes in line with the text that we have in the programme manual. It's included in Annex 2 in the programme manual, that basically let the market dictate or prove that there only is one supplier, and that is, you know, I had a conversation with Mike earlier on this morning, and I was heartened to hear that was the same approach, that the same suggested approach that Mike would be advocating as well. So you go to the market. One of the things you need to make sure as well, just if you're going for, even in general, purchasing equipment, you need to make sure you're using generic terms and not using the names of, like, if you want laptops, it's not a HP laptop or a Dell laptop. You need to talk about specifications. So, and you need to talk about equivalence. You can't give preferential treatment to a certain generic make of something. Mike, maybe you want to add anything to that about
Yeah, particularly, I suppose, with equipment, you are right. And for when you're looking at your specification, you should create what we call an output-based specification for equipment. So what's the output that the equipment is delivering for you, as opposed to saying what the inputs. When you look at inputs and requirements, sometimes you do get drawn into the technicalities of a spec from a supplier or a brand name of a piece of component that they have internally. That can you lead you down a particular direction, but that's not the correct action. You need to be looking at the outputs. What's the equipment delivering? What's it processing? What's the output at the other side? Because there may be an alternative in the market across Europe that could supply it, which is unknown to you or your competitor. And the only way to fully verify that is running a public procurement event.
For the first threshold, €200 to €5,000, it says obtain verbal quotes. Is it preferable to obtain written quotes for these amounts? How would you advise putting together an audit trail for verbal quotes?
Right. Well, it's actually, suppose it's if you're retaining verbal quotes, it's documenting it and taking a record of when you obtained the quote. But in most in regard, it could be even just a price, an email. But whatever, the main thing is that you have to have a price check. It's making sure that you have at least 2 prices that have come back, and you are going then with the cheapest. And normally at that value of expenditure, you're going on price rather than including any other criteria. So it should just be proving that you're going with the cheapest supplier.
Okay, great, thank you. Any advice for non-public entities in advertising above threshold opportunities? We do not have access to e-tenders NI, so do not have direct access to OJU.
In that case, then probably need to have a conversation. But in relation to if it was only national press, unfortunately, if you don't have access to e-tenders NI or e-tenders Ireland, the other option is using the national procurement, or sorry, national press. If the project is wishing to advertise an above threshold contract, they really need to have a conversation with their JS, and we can try and find the solution to that. I know we've had situations where there's a capital build project, and the partner didn't have access to OJ, but one of the councils actually have published the notice on their behalf, and but it still lists the partner as the contracting authority. So if it is a situation where the partner does have an above the threshold contract, it's probably best that they make direct contact with us, and we can try and advise, help them through the process. But the main thing is that there will have to be a solution found for those projects, because they have to ensure that they advertise above threshold contracts on the OJ.
I'll just add there, particularly with the OGP and the e-tender system in Ireland, private companies can be set up to run tenders when you've got state funding or EU funding. So we've done this with many clients in the past, and we're working on a large framework at the moment where 200 private companies will be using e-tenders to procure because of state funding rules. So you can contact the OGP through the support at OGP contact, and you can get set up on e-tenders, which will publish an OJU, which will allow you to run the tender as a private company. You apply to be a buyer. There's a bit of paperwork like everything, but you have to demonstrate the project, the funding source, the projects you're involved in, and you can get access as a buyer, so that's possible.
Mike, we might talk about that, maybe pull together a wee bit of guidance if that's okay, but we can pick that up later.
Definitely, yeah.
That'd be great. If your organisation does not have a standard set of T's and C's, are we allowed to modify vendor contracts?
It was preferred if you would have your own T's and C's, but if your vendor is willing, you can amend their contracts. You need to look at the risk within the vendor contract, and the standard, the utility contracts we're all used to, like electricity and phones and bills and stuff. They're rarely adaptable for anyone, depending, it doesn't matter how much you're spending with them. But typically you'd have your own T's and C's, but failing that, you're going to use the T's and C's of the vendor. But you do need to look at the risk within the vendor's T's and C's. You look at the responsibilities, the KPIs, the milestones, and that they're getting value from the vendor's T's and C's. They're typically favourable to the vendor, so you just need to have a legal review on whether they're fair and appropriate for your requirement. As long as a contract exists, a fair vendor contract is better than no contract. Is probably the bottom line there.
Okay. I think we may have covered this, but just to clarify this for one of our projects, can you clarify issuing notices in 2 jurisdictions? We'll be using e-tenders ROI. Do we need to advertise this on e-tenders NI as well?
Yes, you do, and that's signposting, and I think, Mike, we discussed that. Maybe if you want to maybe talk a wee bit about that, but yes, you do. Yeah. In order to make sure that it's a cross-border, you do need to advertise on both e-tenders Ireland and e-tenders NI, and I'll let Mike talk about how the technical, how you are able to do that.
Yeah, for the e-tenders gov.ie, you can run your tender as normal. You can advertise it to OJU level if needs be. And you'll evaluate and manage your tender on the OGP system as you normally would. However, you do need to advertise it in e-tenders NI. you don't upload your documents, you don't e-tenders NI, you just put a PIN notice, a prior information notice, so you're just it's a signpost, and you include a link to the e-tenders gov tender. So private companies, third-party companies, suppliers in NI that have access to the system will receive their alert. Using their CPV code, they'll get alerted about the opportunity, but when they go to bid for it, they will be using the e-tenders ROI system, the e-tenders gov.ie, and that's absolutely fine. You will notice if you look for Intertrade Ireland, and so a lot of SEUPB projects have done that in the past. You can do it in reverse as well as what I just said. So if you're NI based, run your full tender as normal on e-tenders NI, the sourcing NI platform, and have a PIN notice on the e-tenders ROI system pointing to the NI opportunity.
What I just say is that, and just make sure you keep keep a record of both the PIN notices, and so then when it comes into your controller checks on your expenditure, that you can actually then evidence that you did advertise your opportunity on a cross-border basis.
Thank you. Which EU thresholds apply to a charity?
The charity it doesn't make a difference. This entity, it's actually based if you've got PEACEPLUS funding. If you've been funded by SEUPB and you're a charity, you're obliged by the thresholds that exist. So you're obviously not a public body. You're not governed by public rules typically, but except for this project, you do need to comply to the EU thresholds and the thresholds that exist on this online that we went through earlier. You need to look at where you are in that value. It's not the charity funded by PEACEPLUS needs to be compliant with the EU thresholds.
Yeah, I take it that this question is in relation to the EU threshold rather than above of the EU threshold. Yes, you need to make sure that you're complying with them. Because you are in receipt of public monies, then it brings you into the realm of where you have to then abide by public procurement rules.
Please, can you clarify what qualifies as works? Is it anything under the infrastructure budget?
Yeah, works is typically capital investment, and it's often buildings related. So infrastructure, groundworks, services in that remit as well. So architectural, mechanical engineering, quantity surveyor, etc. So typically works is capital procurement related, directly or indirectly, as in terms of the services around it, which could be planning, ground services, etc.
I think maybe just to be mindful, because if the project is asking a question about the infrastructure works, I'm taking it they're talking about the infrastructure works cost category that they're maybe claiming their expenditure under. They just need to remind themselves of the eligibility guidance notes on each of the cost categories, and making sure then they're claiming the expenditure under the correct cost category. Because if it was in relation to some of those, if it's like architectural services, we actually would regard that under just the external expertise and services, but a cost category, not under infrastructure and works. But if it's an integrated contract where it's part of works and some of the expertise, if it's a dual contract, then yes, that expenditure is coming under the infrastructure and works cost category. So you just need to make sure that the projects are mindful of the scope of the cost categories that then mirror what the regulations allow under them. So just review the fact sheets at the back of the programme manual.
Thank you. Once a contractor is appointed, are they required to adhere to EU public procurement directives or PEACEPLUS procurement regulations?
Sorry, could you just say the beginning of it again, Marianne?
Once a contractor is appointed, are they required to adhere to EU public procurement directives or PEACEPLUS procurement regulations?
PEACEPLUS programme manual rules mirror the public procurement regulations, so they are one of the same.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say both. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. It sounds complicated to develop an over-the-threshold tender which meets the requirements of the EU, UK and Ireland guidelines. Is there support available from SEUPB on this?
This in relation to the introduction of the Public Procurement Act 23. I think that's is it just in relation to just developing a contract?
Doesn't mention the Procurement Act, so I presume it's just about developing the tender.
I think that if depending on, I suppose, the organisation, maybe it's something to raise with their JS case officer, and we can see what assistance. But it wouldn't be something that we'd maybe be having to advise them to see if they could get some external expertise themselves that will assist them in scoping out their tender. I know if it was a capital project, we are offering assistance with through Arvo for those contracts. But I think the best thing is probably to have a conversation with their JS case officer, and that might be something that maybe we can allocate some support, or else suggest that they actually procure, if they don't have that expertise within their own organisation, they really should be maybe procuring that themselves and assist them in developing their contracts.
Great. Can you confirm the percent of the contract that can be extended?
That's included within so it's either 10% for supplies and services and 15% for works, without having to provide too much justification. Other things, then you can modify a contract up to 50%, but there is conditions on that, and you can't alter the nature of the contract. But hopefully the sort of 3 different slides that I've included in the presentation with the traffic lights at the end of it are very useful and do guide you through, and they do ask you questions, and if you follow those points and address the questions, it'll help you determine if the intended modification would be in line with the EU directive or not.
Are the websites eTenders and eTenders NI used to advertise on only, and we can then use our own procurement portal to run the procurement process?
Yeah, I think eTenders and eTenders, and when I say eTenders, NI, just be conscious of the new FTS system in the UK. But absolutely, once the tenders are visible on those platforms, you can use your own portal to manage the procurement. Yes.
I'm just catching up here on questions that have come in since the presentation ended. Let me have a look. There has been several questions, as we expected, about the Procurement Act 2023. What advice can we give to projects at the moment, and where are we in terms of the state of play?
So where we are at present, I know that the JS case officers already have been out to some of the projects, saying to them about, if you are about to commence a new procurement process since sort of the 25th of February, that you really probably should pause that process, because we are at a point where we're trying to get legal advice. We've been talking to Department of Finance, and they have sought legal advice from a KC in relation to basically to see if there's a clause within the Public Procurement Act Schedule 2, there's exemptions, and if there's certain exemptions that allow public bodies that don't have to then follow the Public Procurement Act. It refers to another financial agreement, and the other financial agreement that we have in place was the financing agreement that we had to submit. It's a signatory between the UK government and the EU, and our determination is, and we've been talking to the Commission about it, is that despite the presence of the UK Public Procurement Act, in order for expenditure to be considered eligible for PEACEPLUS, it has to follow the EU directive on public procurement. So we're still waiting for some advice from that, because the reality is that the Procurement Act 2023 does diverge from the EU directive, and as it was explained to me, that because the UK decided to leave the EU, they wanted to make things different, and they wanted to make sure that they weren't following EU rules. So the the Public Procurement Act is different and wouldn't be regarded as being in compliance with the EU Public Procurement Directive. So it is something that it has been discussed at a very high level, and we are still waiting further guidance on that. And once we have further guidance, we will then be able to provide that. We had have hoped that the guidance would have been with us at for today's session, and it's something that we were hoping, but it is currently with the legal teams, and once we have that guidance, we will share that with the projects.
Great, thank you, Emma. Okay, a couple more questions. For PEACEPLUS procurements with a value of 25k plus, do bodies based outside of Ireland need to publish a contract award notice?
No, I think that's in relation to the OGP requirement to advertise contracts. So I think that is our programme manual probably makes that clear, that it's only for public sector bodies based in Ireland should only publish contract information for all contracts above 25,000 on etenders.gov.ie. So it's only for Irish contracting authorities.
Great. Does releasing an OJU notice replace the requirement to advertise on etenders.gov.ie and etenders.ni?
But yes,
you could, that supersedes them. If you directly use OJU, you'll be visible on both anyway. So that is one way to go. Yeah.
Yes, and we found as well that is an option for parties if they want to voluntarily advertise their contract on the OJU, which means then it'll comply with the cross-border requirements of the programme. So if you do publish it on the OJU, it then covers both jurisdictions.
If buying from an existing framework agreement, does this have to be approved by the auditor before the purchase is made?
It doesn't have to be approved by the audit before it's made, but the documentation relating to the framework needs to be made available, and it needs to be available for audit. You need to make sure that the thing to be mindful about frameworks is that the partner needs to actually be listed as a user of the framework. The goods that they want to purchase needs to be within the scope of the framework, and there needs to be available time and available budget within the framework to be able to undertake or to call off it. And you need to respect the rules of the framework if it's either a direct purchase or a call off. But you need to ensure that you have all the documentation regarding the establishment of that, and that framework needs to have been advertised in compliance with the EU Public Procurement Directive. So they're all the things to be mindful about using existing either contracts or existing frameworks.
How long does a price check / quote stay valid for? So, for example, room hire, which you will use numerous times.
No. We would say that you should be getting a price check at the point at which you're going to undertake the work. If you're using something numerous times, that suggests to me that you're disaggregating a contract, and you should have gone for one contract at a higher contract value. You shouldn't be reusing quotes, because you should plan your activities. If you're having room hire, you should know what you need for 6 months or a year and enter into a contract based on that, not having to rely on reusing quotes. And one of the things that I'm actually adding additional text now to the programme manual, just to make it clear that we've sort of seen recently that some projects are providing quotes that they obtained under either Piece 4 or Interreg 5. Those quotes aren't valid. The quotes need to be sought around the time that you want to undertake the delivery of the services. So quotes are time bound, and I think there usually is a limit for higher value, but I know that you shouldn't be reusing quotes.
And this is the final question that we'll take. Can you comment on the use of frameworks in the project, e.g. if a partner has an existing framework for a service?
Yeah, I've already sort of talked to that, to say that yes, you can use a framework, but you need to ensure you have the framework has been advertised on the OJU, that the piece of work that you're hoping to undertake falls within the scope of the framework. You are a user of the framework. There is enough budget and enough time within the framework for you to call off those services, and you have access to the documentation.
Fantastic. Okay, I think we're going to leave it there. We do have a couple of questions that we haven't managed to cover, but unfortunately we are out of time. If I can ask, if you do still have questions that you would like us to answer, please can you submit them via the support portal, or speak to your JS case officer, and they can seek the advice for you. But the support portal is there as well for any questions. But do have a look at the programme manual to see if the information in there can answer any of your questions. Thank you very much to Emma and Mike for a fantastic session. I think the number of questions coming through has shown how engaged people are. And as Emma and Mike had said, I will be sharing the slide deck, and we will be sharing a recording of today's session on our support portal, and I will let you know when they're both available. But thank you so much to Emma and Mike for that. That was fantastic. I'll be in touch once the slide deck and the recording is available. And also just to say, the session that we're running on Thursday is just for capital procurement. You will have received an invite if you do have capital procurement in your project. If you do have capital procurement and you haven't received an invite, please do get in touch with me. Otherwise, it's just for the capital procurement projects. But thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found it useful, and we will circulate all of the documentation from today. And thank you so much again to Emma and Mike, and we will look forward to seeing those projects who will be attending our session on Thursday. But enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you so much.
Very welcome. Thanks all. Have a nice day. Thanks,
Thank you.
Marianne. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.